Welcome to Sleep Flow Studio. London always seemed to breathe at night. Not with the hurried rhythm of daylight, but with the long, slow exhalations of a great city settling into sleep. The fog drifted through the streets as though it had a memory of where it wished to wander, coiling gently around iron fences, brushing past the amber glow of gas lamps and folding itself across rooftops like a pale blanket. Out on Renforth Lane stood a tall, narrow townhouse, its bricks darkened by time, its windows softened by the glow of candlelight. This was the home of Elias Wren, a collector of stories, not the loud, celebrated stories of kings and wars, but the quiet ones, rumors, misunderstandings, forgotten letters, and the dreamy shadows of history that people rarely examined closely. Inside the townhouse, everything felt still. The gentle tick of a brass clock echoed along the hallway. The faint scent of old paper drifted from the study. And upstairs, where Elias kept his treasured collection of Victorian curiosities, a single candle flickered like a patient star waiting for him to arrive. Elias had always been a man of gentle habits. He preferred warm tea to strong wine, preferred listening over speaking, preferred the slow unraveling of a mystery rather than the excitement of solving it too quickly. His friends often joked that he was born a century too late, but Elias loved the present. He simply felt at home in the quiet echoes of the past. Tonight was one of those nights he cherished, the sort where the world outside softened into silence, making room for stories to rise like mist. He entered his study with a wool blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps, though the house seemed to sigh with familiarity at every sound. His desk was cluttered with parchment, old envelopes, notes scribbled in the small hours of previous nights. But at the center of it all rested a small box of dark oak, worn smooth by years of handling. The box contained his most precious collection, Victorian letters, each one carrying a rumor, a strange tale, or a frightened whisper from a century past. Elias knew that many of these letters exaggerated the truth. Victorian England was a place where imagination ran wild, where candlelight made shadows dramatic, and where the absence of information created entire legends. And tonight he would read one of those legends. With careful hands he opened the box. A faint breath of dust rose from within, soft, harmless, familiar. His fingers brushed over the envelopes until he found the one sealed with violet wax. Its color faded but still distinct. He remembered the day he found it in an attic market stall, tucked between recipe books and forgotten postcards. The seller knew nothing of it, but Elias felt a pull the moment he saw it. He brought it to the desk, the candlelight trembling with anticipation. Before opening it, Elias performed a small ritual he had invented for himself over the years. He poured a cup of chamomile tea, letting the steam warm his face. He adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. And most importantly, he allowed his mind to slow, to drift into the soft, quiet curiosity that made reading these letters feel like entering another world. The flame of the candle bent slightly as he broke the old seal. The paper inside crackled softly, a sound that always made Elias feel as though the past were whispering gently to him. He unfolded the letter and smoothed its creases. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was surprisingly elegant. Long strokes, looping tails, the sort of script crafted by someone who believed writing was a performance. At the top there was no name, only a line. For the one who seeks the truth behind shadows. Elias smiled faintly. Many Victorian writers had a flair for drama. The letter began, "Dear reader, if you have come across this, then you have come across the whispers of our age. But do not be afraid, for much that is spoken of with dread is, in truth, only a misunderstanding." The words soothed him immediately. They carried the gentle cadence of someone trying to comfort rather than alarm. And as Elias continued reading, a warm stillness filled the room. Outside the window, the fog pressed softly against the glass as though curious about the story unfolding within. A carriage rattled far in the distance, but even that sound felt sleepy, as though the horses themselves were half dreaming. The letter continued, "In our time, shadows stretch farther than they ought. A candle's flicker becomes a frightening figure. A whispered rumor becomes a warning, and the unknown gives shape to terrors that never truly existed." Elias exhaled slowly. He had studied Victorian fears for years. Strange myths about medical practices, exaggerated tales of secret societies, wild rumors born from strict rules and poor understanding. The Victorians feared what they could not explain, and their imaginations did the rest. But this letter felt different. It didn't revel in the fear, it aimed to dissolve it, to soften the edges of old stories. Elias took another sip of tea, letting the steam drift around him like a second layer of fog. His eyelids felt heavier now, but comfortably so, as though the story welcomed him into a soft, warm world. The candle crackled gently, sending a brief shimmer across the ink. The letter spoke of nights when entire households whispered about odd happenings, about doctors carrying tools that looked strange in the dim light, about hushed conversations behind curtains, about rituals that were nothing more than routine tasks turned mysterious by silence. Elias felt a tenderness in the words. Someone had written this not to scare but to soothe, to remind people that fear often grows in the space where truth is missing. He looked around his study, at the gently swaying shadows on the wall, at the dust floating lazily in the candle glow. It struck him how easily even these harmless shapes could be misread if one allowed imagination to outrun understanding. And the Victorians lived in a world of dim lamps and heavy drapes where so much could be mistaken for something ominous. As Elias continued reading, he lost track of time. The candle melted lower, the room grew warmer, and the steady softness of the letter lulled him deeper into a half-dreaming state. The last line of the first page read, "Before you fear the shadows of our century, remember that shadows only form when there is light." Elias sat back in his chair, wrapped in his blanket, breathing slowly, peacefully. The fog outside pressed closer as though embracing the house. The candle hummed quietly, its flame steady and calm. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow, or perhaps later tonight, he would continue reading. But for now, his thoughts drifted like the fog outside, and he allowed himself to sink gently into the warmth of the moment. The night was deepening. The city was asleep, and the past, softened by understanding, whispered gently in the quiet. The candle had nearly melted halfway down its holder when Elias finally lifted the second page of the letter. The wax, once sharp at the top, now curved like the lip of a sleepy smile, glistening softly in the warm glow. The fog outside had thickened, turning the window into a pale, dreamy canvas. It was the kind of night that stretched gently, as though even time itself wanted to rest. Elias shifted in his chair, pulling his blanket closer. The wooden frame gave a familiar sigh beneath him. The faint ticking of the clock blended with the soft scratching of paper as his fingertips traced the edge of the letter. The room felt like a sanctuary, quiet, warm, sheltered from the world's hurried noise. He began to read. The archivist's voice. To you who reads these lines, know that our age is one woven from shadows and lamplight, and much of what is told in whispers is no more than the trick of a tired eye. The handwriting here grew slightly larger, as though the writer wanted to be sure the reader understood this truth. Elias admired the loops of the ink, the care placed into each flourish. Whoever wrote this letter had not been rushed. They had written with intention, with gentleness. The letter continued. There are those who believe that we Victorians indulge in strange practices, odd rituals, and frightening customs. But, dear reader, so much of what has been called terrifying is merely ordinary life misunderstood. Elias felt a warmth rise in his chest. Yes, he knew this well. He had spent years unraveling such exaggerations, tales spun from half-glimpsed moments, stories born from superstition and dim corridors. Victorian England, after all, was a place where shadows moved freely. A lamp could turn a coat rack into a towering figure. A murmur behind a door could sound like a secret scheme. Even a doctor's medical kit, full of tools crafted for healing, could appear alarming when seen from the wrong angle. The letter seemed to echo his own thoughts. Misunderstandings in the lamplight. The next pages unfolded slowly, full of soft descriptions, almost poetic ones, about common Victorian moments that had been misinterpreted through fear. Our homes are filled with curtains, drapes, shadows, and soft sounds. It is easy to mistake a simple habit for a hidden ritual, easy for a quiet conversation to become a rumor, and easiest of all for the imagination to stitch darkness into the spaces where truth sleeps. Elias paused to sip his tea, now lukewarm but still comforting. He let the words settle inside him like falling dust illuminated by candlelight. His mind drifted to old illustrations he had studied, silhouettes stretching across walls, rooms lit from a single flame, the long narrow hallways of Victorian townhouses that seemed to swallow light whole, all of it so atmospheric and so prone to misunderstanding. The letter continued with small examples. A family kneeling by their hearth in prayer, mistaken as performing a secret ritual. A doctor's evening rounds misheard as visits of some secret order. Neighbors exchanging quiet private advice described as coded speech. The sound of pipes rattling in old homes believed to be voices behind walls. Elias smiled gently. He had read countless accounts of such harmless things transforming into frightening tales. It was the nature of the era, an age of curiosity, strict etiquette, and dim rooms that made imagination flare wildly. The writer understood this deeply. The weight of silence. The letter then grew more contemplative. It is not terror that shapes our age, but silence. For in silence the mind invents. Elias leaned closer, intrigued by the clarity of the writer's observation. When a neighbor draws a curtain, some imagine secrecy. When a woman walks quickly down the street, some imagine scandal. When a doctor carries a locked case, some imagine horrors. But all are merely shadows stretched beyond their meaning. He felt a stirring sympathy for the Victorians described here. How much of their lives had been misunderstood simply because the world lacked the words, the science, or the openness to explain things clearly. Fear thrives where knowledge is thin, and the writer, the gentle archivist, seemed determined to restore balance, to replace fear with understanding. Clarifying the archivist's purpose. The next passage revealed something deeply personal. I write this letter so that one day someone, perhaps you, may soften the tales of our century, for they are told far too sharp. Their edges have grown jagged with retelling. Elias rested the page against his knee, letting those lines wash over him, softening. That word lingered. So much of history, he thought, is remembered harshly. Not because it truly was harsh, but because the stories have hardened over time. He imagined the archivist sitting at a desk not unlike his own, quill in hand, the flame of an oil lamp dancing beside them. Perhaps they too had worn a blanket over their shoulders on cold nights. Perhaps they too had listened to the hum of a sleeping world outside their window. The archivist might have even paused as he did now, letting their thoughts drift before writing again. The letter went on. I wish not to erase our eccentricities, for every age has them. I simply wish to tell them gently, for gentleness is closer to truth. Elias felt something soften inside him as he read this. He loved that sentiment, loved the idea that history didn't have to be frightening to be compelling, that even the strangest customs, when told kindly, could become simply human. There's a moment of drifting. The warmth of the room settled heavier on Elias's shoulders. His eyelids dipped. The rhythm of the words, slow, thoughtful, soothing, began to flow like a lullaby. He let the letter rest on his lap for a moment and closed his eyes. Outside, the fog pressed against the window pane with the gentleness of a sleeping breath. A carriage whispered by on distant cobblestones. Somewhere in the house, the settling wood gave a quiet, peaceful pop. All of it blended into the soft hum of a night unhurried. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. The story was becoming less something he read and more something he drifted into. When he opened his eyes again, the flame of the candle looked softer, its edges melting into the warm air. He returned to the letter. For the tone shift toward reassurance. Should you ever hear of our most terrifying behaviors, take a breath and remember, that which is frightening in rumor is often gentle in truth. The ink thinned slightly, as though the writer had dipped the quill again mid-thought. Our shadows appear large because our lamps are small. Our voices sound strange because our walls echo. Our customs seem odd because they are old. But we are not so different from you. Elias felt a wave of calm pass through him. The writer had a gift. Each sentence felt like a soft hand resting gently on the shoulder. He imagined them writing for someone who might one day be afraid of old legends, hoping to ease that fear before it took root. Artas at night deepens. As Elias neared the end of the second section of the letter, the room seemed even quieter, as though the house itself were listening. Take this knowledge with rest. Let it quiet the corners of your mind. For the truth behind shadows is simple. Shadows exist only where light lives. Elias folded the page with slow care, feeling its age in the fibers of the paper. He placed it gently beside the first page, the candle casting a golden glow over both sheets. The fog outside the window looked thicker now, like soft wool pressed against the glass. It made the entire room feel more enclosed, more intimate, as if he were reading inside a small bubble of warmth floating in the night. He leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply, savoring the calm that had settled over him. This was a letter written not to frighten but to soothe, and he felt soothed completely. He closed his eyes for a moment more before preparing himself to read the next part. The night lingered softly around him. The shadows were gentle, and somewhere inside the letter the archivist had more truths waiting to unfold. Morning did not come to Elias with any urgency. When he finally stirred, the fog still lingered outside his window, clinging to the city as though the night had not quite finished with it. The candle on his desk had shrunk to a stub, and a faint line of dawn-gray light rested across the floorboards. The letter, carefully folded, still waited where he had left it. Elias rubbed the sleep from his eyes, stretched beneath the soft weight of his blanket, and allowed the quiet of morning to settle over him. The stillness felt like an extension of the night, a bridge between the story he'd read and the world he lived in. After a simple breakfast and a slow cup of warm tea, he returned to his study. The fog outside looked even thicker than before, blurring rooftops and softening chimneys into gentle shapes. It was perfect weather for reading. He opened the box once more, and the violet-sealed letter, its pages smelling faintly of age and lavender, seemed to invite him back into its world. He smoothed out the third page. This part began differently, almost as if the archivist had shifted from explanation into storytelling. "Let me take you now," the letter said, "to a small town where shadows were not frightening but merely misunderstood." Elias leaned back, letting his mind drift into the past as he began to read. Gwenin, the village of Hartham. There was a village nestled between two quiet hills, far from the bustling streets of London. It was called Hartham, a name that sounded warm even in the coldest seasons. Smoke curled gently from its chimneys. Lamplight flickered behind lace curtains, and the cobbled pathways wound through the town like slow-moving streams. Hartham was quaint, peaceful, predictable, but it had one unusual trait. It was a place where rumors traveled faster than the wind. And not harmful rumors, not cruel ones, but soft, almost playful misunderstandings that the townspeople delighted in sharing. In Victorian times, when the evenings stretched long and entertainment was scarce, a small mystery could bloom into a grand tale within hours. The letter described the village lovingly, sketching its characters like familiar old friends. Was Mrs. Witherby, the embellisher. At the center of Hartham lived Mrs. Agnes Witherby, the town's baker and self-appointed storyteller. She was a cheerful woman with round cheeks, flour permanently dusted across her apron, and a fondness for turning simple events into dramatic narratives. If a cat darted under a porch, Mrs. Witherby would swear it had been chasing a ghost. If a neighbor lit a candle late at night, she insisted it was a sign of a secret meeting. If a child whispered to another in the marketplace, she believed they were plotting adventures far too grand for their size. Her stories were never malicious, they were simply enthusiastic. And the townsfolk, who loved a bit of excitement, let her imagination run wild. The letter painted her with such charm that Elias almost felt he could hear her voice, bright, breathless, full of awe, echoing through the village bakery. Well, Mr. Penwell, keeper of books and theories. Next was Mr. Roland Penwell, the village bookbinder. Tall, thin, with spectacles he constantly adjusted, he carried the solemn air of someone who took stories far more seriously than they deserved. If Mrs. Witherby supplied the color, Mr. Penwell supplied the logic, albeit logic shaped by speculation rather than truth. If Mrs. Witherby claimed someone saw shadows moving strangely in a window, Mr. Penwell would nod gravely and suggest that perhaps the residents were part of a scholarly midnight society. If a carriage passed through town unusually late, he would stroke his chin and mutter about coded messages and clandestine travels. He meant no harm, he simply loved the idea of mystery. To him, imagination was not something to fear. It was something to be embraced, studied, and admired. We sum the Dalloway sisters. Margaret and Eliza Dalloway, seamstresses who shared both a home and a tiny shop, contributed their own flavor to the town's rumor-laden charm. They were kind, gentle women, always stitching, always humming, always listening. Their talent lay in taking whispers and turning them into stories threaded with romance. If a couple spoke quietly in the corner of a cafe, the sisters would insist it was a secret engagement. If a traveler looked lost, they believed he must be meeting someone in private. And whenever Mrs. Witherby or Mr. Penwell added a dramatic twist to a tale, the sisters embellished it with emotion. A shadow in the window? Ah, Margaret would sigh. Perhaps someone pining for a long-lost love. A late-night carriage? Eliza would nod dreamily. A message delivered under moonlight, surely. Their versions were always the softest, always the sweetest. or young Oliver the observer. Among them all roamed Oliver Trent, an errand boy with wide eyes and a talent for showing up in exactly the wrong or right place at the right time. Oliver had a habit of overhearing the adults' conversations, never intentionally but out of sheer curiosity. He would skate along the cobblestones, run across yards, peek into open doorways, and gather snippets of stories like loose coins. He rarely spoke, but his expressions were enough. When he widened his eyes, the adults listened. When he nodded gravely, the others leaned in. And when he shook his head slowly, oh, that was enough to confirm any rumor, no matter how wild. The archivist described Oliver with affection, calling him a collector of moments, a silent witness to the small dramas of everyday life. Elias chuckled softly. He could almost see the boy darting through town, eager and bright. Oscar, how rumors became tales. In Hartham, rumors didn't grow through fear. They grew through interest, through entertainment, through long evenings with little else to do. The letter painted vivid scenes. Villagers gathering by the hearth to exchange stories. Mrs. Witherby stirring pots of soup while recounting the latest sighting. Mr. Penwell polishing his spectacles, ready to unveil his theories. The Dalloway sisters sewing thoughtfully as they added soft romantic twists. Oliver slipping in and out, nodding solemnly as though confirming everything. And so, a simple event, a curtain drawn too quickly, became a mystery. A candle burning late became a secret. A quiet conversation became a plot. Yet every rumor, once traced back to its origin, turned out to be completely harmless. Elias found himself smiling as he read. There was something soothing about a town where fear never hardened into panic, where misunderstandings were simply playful stories, and where the most dramatic tale ever told involved a doctor forgetting his lantern and causing a panicked whisper that a ghost roamed the road. Badimar, the archivist's observation. Near the end of the third section of the letter, the archivist wrote, "If one were to look from afar, one might think our people frightened, our customs strange, our shadows deep. But if one stood among us, truly among us, they would find warmth, curiosity, and a love for stories far greater than any love for fear." Elias reread that line, letting its warmth settle in his chest. Yes, that was the heart of it. Rumors did not always come from darkness. Sometimes they came from a yearning for connection, for excitement, for a little spark of wonder in the quiet hours of life. The fog outside pressed closer to the window. The room grew still, the silence deep yet friendly, as though the night itself listened. Let Hartham be a reminder. Not every shadow hides a secret. Not every whisper hides truth. And not every tale is meant to frighten. Some are meant simply to pass the time, softening the night until morning comes. Elias folded the page carefully, setting it atop the others. The warmth of the story lingered in the air. The characters of Hartham felt alive, drifting softly through his imagination like figures in a dream. He took a breath, closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, he was ready for whatever the archivist had written next. The fog had returned by the time Elias reached the bottom of the staircase, drifting through the glass panes of the front door and settling in lazy spirals along the floorboards. It gave the hallway a dreamlike sheen, as though the house itself had begun to float. Elias, wrapped in his blanket and carrying the diary of Miss Adeline Clark, stepped slowly into the corridor. He had left the parlor lamp burning, its warm glow pooling beneath it like a golden puddle. The rest of the hall lay in gentle darkness, the sort that never threatened, only hushed. Shadows clung to the edges of the walls in wavering strokes. They reminded him of the brushwork of old painters, soft and deliberate. He passed a cabinet that held his small collection of pocket watches. Tonight, their ticking aligned so perfectly that they almost sounded like a single giant heart beating in the quiet. The sound soothed him as he walked toward the sitting room, his favorite room for reading when the night grew heavy and soft. Inside, the fire had dwindled to low embers glowing faintly beneath a shell of ash. Elias knelt beside the hearth and stirred them gently. They brightened, glowing deeper and warmer, filling the room with a slow-breathing pulse of amber light. He settled into his chair, the one with the curved wooden arms polished from years of resting elbows, and laid the diary across his lap. The cover felt warmer now, as though handled frequently by hands long gone. The scent of the paper drifted upward, dry and faintly floral, as though the pages themselves remembered the sachets Victorians tucked into drawers. He opened to the next section. A loose sheet fluttered free. It drifted lazily toward the floor, caught by a soft current of warm air. Elias picked it up carefully. The paper had yellowed unevenly, like something that had once been pressed inside a book and forgotten. The handwriting was the same as before, elegant, balanced, and thoughtful. At the top, a date, January 14th, 1872. Below it, another evening of misunderstandings. Elias smiled faintly. He could already sense Miss Clark's gentle frustration. He began reading. This morning I overheard Mrs. Whitcomb speaking to the housemaid in tones of the most dramatic alarm. She had seen Dr. Hollingford carrying what she believed to be a dreadful contraption, some instrument used in her imagination for unspeakable things. In truth, it was a folding stethoscope, but the dimness of the hall, combined with Mrs. Whitcomb's lively sense of the theatrical, transformed it into something frightful. Elias chuckled softly, his breath warm in the quiet room. He could almost picture the poor physician, tired, carrying a simple medical tool, confronted by a house full of gasps and whispers. He read on. Only it is remarkable how easily fear paints shadows where none exist. Later in the afternoon, I asked Dr. Hollingford about the instrument. He laughed, a gentle laugh, not mocking, and explained its workings to me with a kindness that eased even my own unspoken uncertainties. I wonder why our age insists upon cloaking simple truths in the most elaborate fictions. The fire crackled softly, offering its own commentary. Elias leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the imagined scene drift around him like watercolor. The Victorian world often behaved this way, whispers filling the spaces that light had not yet reached. A simple object could become a frightening symbol simply because people refused to ask questions in daylight. He turned the page. This evening I walked the corridor outside the servants' quarters. A faint tapping echoed there, and for a moment even I, who pride myself on reason, felt a flutter of unease. But with a candle lifted, the truth revealed itself. A loose shutter moved in the evening breeze, tapping gently against the wall. And yet, those who passed without a candle swore it was the footsteps of something otherworldly. Elias felt the diary warming in his hands, as though Miss Clark's candor carried its own quiet glow. The fire behind him deepened its color, turning the room into a cocoon of gentle warmth. He read on. Fear is not our enemy, I suppose. Only the silence that grows when no one dares to speak its name. How different our world might be if every corridor held a candle, and every whisper paused long enough for understanding to enter. Elias breathed out slowly. That sentence lingered. The room seemed to agree. The fire flickered softly. The fog pressed gently against the window, and the ticking watches aligned into a quiet lullaby. He closed the diary just long enough to rest his hand on its cover. Miss Clark was not only observant, she was kind. Her attempts to soften fear with clarity felt like a warm hand placed on the shoulder of history. He opened the diary again. A final note at the bottom of the loose page read, "Tomorrow I will write of the garden lanterns, how even they gave rise to strange tales. Perhaps someday someone will read this and laugh gently, understanding us better than we understood ourselves." Elias smiled, warmth spreading through him like tea. "I understand you," he murmured, barely louder than the settling embers. He placed the loose sheet beside the earlier entries, aligning its edges carefully. Then he closed the diary with a soft, contented sigh. The room felt as though it had changed tone, deepened, quieted, grown softer in the way late nights often do. Elias leaned back, allowing his eyes to drift half shut. The fog outside curled like a cat. The embers glowed like sleepy eyes. And somewhere upstairs, the old townhouse creaked a reassuring, familiar sound. He whispered, "Tomorrow I'll continue." But tonight he let himself drift. Light as dust, warm as fire, gentle as Miss Clark's thoughtful words. The night deepened around the townhouse, folding itself into gentle layers of stillness. Elias, wrapped warmly in his blanket, kept the diary close as he moved from the sitting room to the conservatory, a glass-walled corner of the house where plants slept quietly through winter and moonlight brushed everything with a faint silver sheen. The conservatory was his refuge. Here the world felt softer. The leaves barely rustled. The glass sighed as the fog pressed against it, and the cool air smelled faintly of soil and old stone pots. Candles had never been allowed in this room, but a small hooded lamp waited on the table, casting a muted circle of gold across the wooden surface. Elias placed the diary down and breathed deeply. The plants, the shadows, the cold glass, all of it felt like an extension of the Victorian tales he carried tonight. It was easy to imagine Miss Adeline Clark standing in such a place, holding her own lantern, observing the world with gentle curiosity. He opened the diary to the next entry. A soft flake of dried leaf, pressed perhaps decades earlier, slipped from between the pages, twirling down like a quiet sigh. Elias caught it between his fingers. It crumbled instantly, becoming only memory and dust. He turned the next page. A fresh date awaited him. January 17th, 1872, and below it, as though she knew he would read at night, "Tonight the garden has given birth to yet another misunderstanding." Elias smiled with fond anticipation. He began, "Breeze. The winter lanterns have been hung across the garden path as they are every year. Small glass globes, each holding a simple oil flame. Their purpose is only to keep the path lit for the gardeners and servants who must move between the sheds even in the dark season. But simplicity in this house rarely remains simple." Outside the conservatory, a branch scratched gently against the window. Elias didn't startle. He simply glanced toward the sound and watched the fog outside swirl, wrapping itself around the skeletal trees in the garden. The parallel between the real night and the one described in the diary made everything feel beautifully connected. He returned to reading. "Earlier this evening I overheard two maids whispering urgently near the stairwell. They claimed to have seen strange figures drifting between the lanterns, figures that glowed faintly blue as though lit from within. In hushed, dramatic tones, they insisted the garden was haunted." I refrained from interrupting. Curiosity, after all, is best approached gently. Elias chuckled under his breath. Victorian households, with their vast hallways and their many rooms of quiet tasks, were fertile grounds for midnight imagination. He continued. Later, with a small lantern of my own, I went to the garden to see these blue figures. The air was cold enough that my breath fogged before me, drifting in soft clouds. And there, between the glass lanterns, I saw the source of the mystery." Elias leaned forward slightly in his chair. Condensation. The warm lantern flames met the cold night air, creating delicate veils of mist that caught the light in shifting hues. When a person walked through it, even at a distance, their shape appeared blurred, tinted, and ghost-like. Elias could practically see it. The soft glow, the moving fog, the illusion forming and dissolving. Even in his modern house, the effect would be mesmerizing. He read on. I stood there for a long while, letting the mist brush against my coat sleeves. I waved my hand gently through it, and the shapes bent, stretched, and swayed like dancers in slow motion. It was beautiful, not frightening. Yet beauty often takes on the appearance of fear when seen in the corner of one's eye. Elias rested his hand on the diary, taking a slow breath. Miss Clark had a gift, the ability to make the simplest moment feel tender, reflective, and human. She saw the world with clarity, but never with harshness. The diary continued. When I returned to the house, I found the maids still whispering. So I sat with them by the kitchen hearth and described what I had seen. I expected disbelief or more whispers, but instead one of them sighed with visible relief. The other laughed timidly, covering her face. Fear, once understood, becomes almost a friend. The conservatory fell so still that Elias could hear the faint humming of the glass cooling outside. He turned the page. Mrs. Whitcomb, however, still insists the garden is home to wandering spirits. I have learned it is best not to challenge her. Some people need their ghosts, I suppose. Tiny, dramatic anchors that make their world feel more interesting. Elias let that idea rest in his mind. The Victorians, with their strict rules and narrow corridors of propriety, often built little pockets of fantasy just to give their imagination something to hold on to. But Miss Clark wasn't mocking her peers. Her tone remained soft, understanding. He read the final lines of the entry. Tonight the lanterns remain lit, swaying faintly in the winter breeze. The mist moves around them like slow water. If someone were to pass the garden now, they might swear the place is alive with pale figures. But now that I know the truth, I find the scene comforting. Even the illusions of our age, once understood, become gentle companions. Elias closed the diary slowly, letting the quiet settle around him like another blanket. Outside the glass walls, the garden he tended through modern seasons looked strangely Victorian tonight. The fog, the bare branches, the faint glimmer of moisture on the glass. For a moment, the years felt thin, as if Miss Clark herself had walked just beyond the line of visibility. He placed his hand on the diary's cover. "Thank you," he whispered. Not sure exactly why he said it, but feeling the sincerity regardless. The conservatory felt warmer now, though the air remained cool. He gathered the diary in his hands, the hinge creaking softly as though sighing into sleep. The house was silent. The garden was still, and the story, like the fog, drifted gently into the next chapter. The house had grown very still by the time Elias left the conservatory. A deeper quiet had settled in, one that seemed to stretch through the hallways like a soft woolen blanket laid gently across the floorboards. The fog outside pressed close to the windows, and the glass panes trembled with the quiet chill of midnight. Elias carried Miss Clark's diary with both hands as though it were something fragile and warm. He closed the conservatory door behind him, listening to the soft latch click, then moved slowly through the dim corridor. The lamps flickered faintly, their golden halos swaying as though drowsy. He knew exactly where he wanted to read next. There was a small room on the second floor, rarely used, often forgotten, filled with cushions, books, and a single chaise by the window. He called it the Room of Quiet Echoes, not because it echoed in the usual sense, but because sound seemed to grow softer there, more thoughtful, more willing to linger before fading. As he climbed the stairs, the old house gave its familiar sighs. The creak of a step, the faint crackle of cooling wood, the distant hum of wind sliding past the chimney. Each sound felt like a voice of reassurance. He reached the second-floor corridor, where the air always felt slightly cooler, and opened the door to the quiet room. The darkness inside was gentle, almost welcoming. When he lit a small lamp on the short table near the chaise, its warm glow spread across the room like a spilled cup of honey. He settled into the chaise, pulling a throw blanket over his legs. The house felt almost weightless at this hour, as though time itself were slowing down to match the rhythm of his breath. With a small exhale, he opened the diary to the next entry. A ribbon marked the page, though Elias couldn't remember seeing it before. It must have been placed there by someone long ago, a quiet hand guiding him to the next story. The date read, January 20th, 1872, and below, in Miss Clark's graceful handwriting, "The matter of the attic whispers has returned again tonight." Elias raised an eyebrow. Victorian attics were notorious for being misinterpreted. Drafts in the timbers, animals in the rafters, pipes expanding and contracting. But he could already imagine the sorts of tales such noises would birth in a house full of restless minds. He continued reading. For several weeks, faint noises have come from the upper attic, especially at night. I paid them little mind at first. Houses, like people, make their own sounds in their sleep. But the staff has grown uneasy. They whisper of secrets above our heads. Elias smiled at that line. Houses did make their own sounds, especially old ones. He had learned over the years that his own townhouse creaked most when the night was coldest, or when the fog outside lay heavily on the roof like a soft, wet blanket. Miss Clark wrote on. Because Whitcomb insists the noises resemble footsteps. Not heavy footsteps, mind you. Light ones like those of a child. She claims they appear only after midnight and vanish the moment anyone climbs the stairs. Elias rested a hand on the diary and looked toward his own attic door down the hall. It was closed, quiet, the air beneath it perfectly still. He returned to the diary. Tonight at 11:30, I climbed the attic stairs alone with a lamp. The house was silent except for the distant murmur of the wind. Each step creaked in complaint, and the lamp's flame wavered as though nervous. Yet I felt strangely peaceful, as though the house itself were accompanying me. Elias leaned deeper into the chaise, letting the image unfurl in his mind. The soft glow of a flame, the long Victorian staircase, the quiet determination of Miss Clark walking upward despite whispers of ghosts. He read on. Year. Upon reaching the attic, I found nothing unusual. The trunks rested where they always had. The rafters curled overhead like wooden ribs, and the small window let in a faint sliver of moonlight. But something else caught my attention. Elias turned the next page with care. A small gap beneath the window frame had widened. Cold air slipped through it in little sighs, and each time the wind outside shifted, a soft high whistle threaded through the room. When the drafts passed through various beams, they created a pattern of sound, gentle, shifting, and strangely reminiscent of footsteps. Elias nodded slowly. He had read many Victorian accounts of such misunderstandings. Architecture becoming narrative, weather becoming rumor, sound becoming superstition. Miss Clark continued. Person, I felt no fear, only a deep affection for how easily we mistake the world's small murmurs for something larger. I wedged a folded cloth into the gap, and the whispering ceased immediately. He exhaled, smiling. He imagined her standing there in the moonlit attic, soft light brushing the dust motes into existence, listening carefully to the quiet to understand it rather than flee from it. He read the final lines. For Kim, when I went back downstairs, the staff waited anxiously. I told them what I had discovered. Some sighed in relief, others looked almost disappointed. Humans, I think, enjoy a bit of mystery, but fear loses its charm the moment truth steps in. Still, I am glad to have given them peace tonight. Elias closed the diary slowly, letting the words settle. Outside, the fog shifted against the window with a delicate sigh of its own. The house beneath him creaked softly as though adjusting in its sleep, and from the fireplace down the hall he heard a faint settling of embers. Quiet, warm, familiar. He let his eyes drift half shut, feeling the weight of the diary in his hands like the calming pressure of a warm stone. The Victorian world felt so near now, not frightening, not dramatic, simply human, full of small misunderstandings, gentle corrections, and people trying their best to understand the shadows around them. Elias's breathing slowed. The quiet room seemed to hum faintly with the softness of old stories and warm lamplight. Tomorrow, he thought, he would read the final part. But for now, the night embraced him, and the diary rested peacefully on his lap. The house was almost asleep. Elias could feel it in the way the walls held their breath, in the way the fog outside pressed against the windows like a drowsy visitor seeking shelter, and in the soft hum of silence that always settled just before dawn. He remained in the room of quiet echoes for a long while after finishing Miss Clark's attic entry, simply listening to the stillness. Eventually, though, he stood, feeling the slow weight of fatigue settle gently across his shoulders. The diary rested in his hand like a familiar warmth. There was only one place left for him to visit tonight. The place where he kept the oldest letters, the most fragile papers, the ones he always saved for last. He moved toward his study. The hallway felt longer in the dim glow of the lamps, each pool of soft light stretching across the carpet like shallow golden water. The fog thickened outside the windows, drawing the world into a muted hush. Inside the study, the air seemed a degree warmer, as though the room had been waiting for him. The candle he had left earlier had nearly dwindled to its base, flickering weakly, but still alive. Its trembling flame painted soft shadows across the shelves of journals and old envelopes. Elias set the diary down on his desk. For a moment he simply looked at it, the worn leather, the slightly frayed corners, the way the pages curled ever so slightly from age. Miss Clark's calm, thoughtful voice felt close, almost present in the room. Then, with a slow breath, Elias opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay a small wooden box, dark oak, polished with age, its hinges older than most of the books in his study. This was where the most delicate documents rested. Letters so fragile that even touching them felt like waking something that had long chosen to sleep. He lifted the box out and placed it on the desk. A soft creak answered him when he opened it, a sound like a whisper of acknowledgement. Inside, a handful of envelopes lay bundled with a thin ribbon. Elias untied the ribbon carefully, not wanting to disturb the brittle seams. But one envelope sat apart from the rest. It was pale cream in color, smoother than the others, as though someone with steady hands and careful habits had preserved it meticulously, sealed with a faded blue wax, lighter, thinner, almost expectant. Elias knew immediately it must have belonged to Miss Clark. He lifted it gently and broke the seal, the wax crumbling in quiet fragments. Inside was a folded letter, shorter than the others but written in the same graceful script he had come to recognize so well. As he unfolded it, the paper made a delicate sigh, its edges trembling faintly. He began to read. Resuar. If you are reading this, dear stranger of another time, then I trust you have understood us enough to see our flaws with kindness. Elias felt something warm rise in his chest. This house and the age in which I lived were full of shadows, some real, most imagined. Thursday, we whispered of frightening practices, of rituals we did not understand, of fears born not of truth but of silence. The candle flickered as though leaning closer. And I wish the world to know that much of what we feared was only the echo of our own uncertainty. Erder. And if ever our stories are told again, let them be told gently. Elias swallowed softly. He turned to the next lines, but the tone of the ink shifted here. Its stroke slower, more personal. Buddington, I do not know who you are, reader. But if you have found this letter, then you are someone who listens. Oh, see, when the world needs such people. Elias set his hand over the page. The room had grown impossibly still. He read on. Try to do not fear the shadows of your own century. Do not let imagination turn questions into terrors. Hold a candle to the unknown, and you will find that most things are gentler than you thought. The final lines were softer, smaller, as though written with a tired but peaceful hand. If our whispers have reached you across time, let them reach you as comfort, not fear. The past is not a monster. It is only a house full of rooms, full of echoes, waiting for someone patient enough to understand them. Elias closed his eyes. The letter rested lightly against his fingers, fragile but steady, like the last breath of a long-forgotten dream. He placed it beside the diary. The candle's glow washed over both, making their surfaces appear warm, alive, almost breathing. Outside, the fog pressed closer. The house creaked in a gentle sigh, and in the quiet warmth of the study, Elias felt the Victorian world settle, not as something dark or frightening, but as something deeply human. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the night sink into him. The softness of the stories, the kindness in Miss Clark's words, the slow unraveling of fears that had once seemed enormous. He whispered into the warm stillness, "Thank you for trusting me." The fog outside dimmed the world into a soothing haze. The house nestled around him like a blanket, and the past, far from terrifying, felt like a companion sitting quietly beside him. Elias let his eyes drift shut. The candle softened. The night deepened, and the last echo of the Victorian age folded itself gently into sleep.